At 35, Alexander Grant was a man most would envy. He stood at the pinnacle of success, commanding the helm of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. His wealth was staggering, with opulent mansions sprawled across 3 continents, luxury cars parked in immaculate garages, and invitations to exclusive galas and high-profile meetings filling his calendar. Yet, beneath the polished exterior of his life, Alexander carried a heavy, invisible weight. Despite the glittering achievements and the privileges that came with his status, he felt a profound emptiness gnawing at his soul. Alexander's journey to success had been anything but easy. Raised by a single mother in a modest home, he had grown up watching her struggle to provide for their family. From a young age, he vowed that he would never live in want again. He poured himself into his studies and later into his career, working tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder and build his empire. By his early 30s, he had achieved what most could only dream of: fame, fortune, and influence. But in his relentless pursuit of success, something essential had been left behind. As the years passed, the weight of his achievements began to feel less like a triumph and more like a prison. His relationships felt shallow, his conversations scripted, and his connections transactional. He was surrounded by people who admired his wealth but never truly saw him. Each morning he woke up in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why he felt so unfulfilled. The joy of life seemed to have slipped through his fingers, replaced by a hollow routine. One crisp morning, Alexander's life took an unexpected turn. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he reluctantly answered. On the other end of the line was his family lawyer, Mr. Bennett, whose tone was unusually grave. The call concerned the last will of Alexander's late grandfather, a man he had greatly admired. Alexander listened intently as Mr. Bennett explained the terms of the will. To his shock, his grandfather had left behind a peculiar condition for him to receive his inheritance. Alexander would need to leave his life of privilege behind for 1 month and live like an ordinary person. He would have to reside in a modest neighborhood, work a simple job, and reconnect with life outside the world of wealth and power. At first, Alexander dismissed the idea as absurd. Why would he need to prove himself to receive what was already his? Yet, as the days passed, the thought lingered in his mind. The emptiness he felt, the disconnection from the world. Perhaps this challenge could be the answer he hadn't realized he was searching for. The opportunity to rediscover who he was, beyond the billions. Finally, with a deep breath and a sense of apprehension, Alexander made his decision. He would honor his grandfather's wishes and embrace this challenge. Little did he know, this journey would change his life in ways he could never imagine. After agreeing to the terms of his grandfather's will, Alexander met with Mr. Bennett to go over the details. The conditions were clear and non-negotiable. He would step away from his current lifestyle entirely, without access to his wealth, properties, or influence. His grandfather had been meticulous in crafting the challenge, ensuring Alexander wouldn't find any loopholes. To make matters more interesting, his grandfather had added a personal twist. Alexander was required to spend the month with one of 3 women whose profiles had been carefully selected before his passing. When Mr. Bennett handed Alexander a sealed envelope containing the profiles, the weight of the task hit him. How could he possibly choose a partner for this journey based on a few photos and descriptions? Still, he opened the envelope, revealing 3 profiles, each accompanied by a picture. There was Clara, a nurse dedicated to helping underserved communities, who radiated kindness and strength. Then there was Naomi, a journalist known for her sharp wit and unyielding determination. Finally, there was Elena, a teacher who exuded warmth and a passion for making a difference in the lives of her students. As Alexander studied the profiles, one detail stood out to him about Elena: her emphasis on valuing simplicity and genuine human connections. He couldn't quite explain it, but something about her resonated deeply. Perhaps it was her smile in the photo, or perhaps it was the way her description mirrored the authenticity he realized he'd been longing for. After much deliberation, he informed Mr. Bennett of his choice. He would spend the month with Elena Morales. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Alexander rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. It was worlds apart from his sprawling mansions. barely furnished with creaky floors and a single window that overlooked a noisy street. He packed a single suitcase with only the essentials, leaving behind his tailored suits and luxury watches. He also worked with Mr. Bennett to create a plausible backstory. He would pose as a junior IT technician starting fresh in a new city. To complete the illusion, he practiced answering questions about his ordinary life. The final goodbye to his old life came on a quiet evening. Alexander stood in his penthouse, gazing out at the city skyline, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation. For so long he had relied on his wealth to define him, but now he was stepping into the unknown. He wasn't just leaving behind his comfort, he was leaving behind the identity he had built over decades. Alexander's first day in his new life was a jarring departure from everything he had known. The apartment he rented was modest, to put it generously. The walls were painted a dull beige, the floors creaked with every step, and the kitchen was stocked with only the bare essentials. No high-tech appliances, no personal chef to prepare gourmet meals. As he unpacked his single suitcase, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was no longer Alexander Grant, billionaire CEO. For the next month, he was just Alex, an ordinary man starting fresh. The first real test came the following morning, waking up to the sound of traffic outside his window instead of the gentle hum of central air in his penthouse was disorienting. He brewed a cup of instant coffee, his first, and made a simple sandwich for breakfast. Gone were the elaborate meals prepared by private chefs. This was survival. Though he had expected to feel miserable, there was something oddly satisfying about the simplicity of it all. Navigating the city as an ordinary person was another challenge entirely. Alexander had rarely stepped foot on public transportation in his life, let alone relied on it. Armed with a subway map and a few tips from online forums, he ventured into the crowded, noisy world of commuter trains. The experience was overwhelming at first, the sheer press of people, the confusing stops, the lack of personal space. But as the day went on, he found himself intrigued. Conversations buzzed around him, stories of daily struggles, small triumphs, and shared laughter. These were lives lived authentically, something he hadn't encountered in years. His new job as an IT technician brought its own set of surprises. For someone used to making decisions that impacted thousands, troubleshooting minor software issues for frustrated coworkers seemed almost laughable. Yet there was a strange sense of accomplishment in completing even the smallest tasks. A coworker's gratitude for fixing a stubborn program felt more personal, more real, than any corporate accolade he had ever received. By the end of the day, Alexander returned to his apartment feeling exhausted, but strangely fulfilled. There were no lavish dinners to attend, no meetings to prepare for, just a quiet evening in his modest home. As he stared at the ceiling, the emptiness he had carried for years felt a little lighter. The next day, Alexander prepared for an even more daunting task, meeting Elena Morales. They had arranged to meet at a small cafe in a quiet corner of the city. He arrived early, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. Dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, he sat in a corner, sipping his lukewarm coffee and watching the door. When Elena walked in, she radiated a warmth that immediately set him at ease. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and carried a tote bag filled with books. Her smile was genuine, disarming Alexander's usual guarded demeanor. "Alex?" she asked, extending her hand. He nodded, standing awkwardly before shaking her hand. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for meeting me." Over the next hour, they talked about everything from their favorite books to their thoughts on education and community. Alexander found himself captivated not just by her words, but by the passion behind them. Elena wasn't just kind, she was grounded, sincere, and refreshingly real. As they parted ways, Alexander realized something profound. He had spent the entire afternoon without once thinking about his wealth, his company, or his status. For the first time in years, he felt like just a man, no titles, no pretenses. Walking back to his apartment, a small smile played on his lips. This challenge, daunting as it was, might just be the best thing to ever happen to him. The days that followed Alexander's first meeting with Elena were transformative in ways he had never anticipated. Each conversation with her felt like a window into a world he had long forgotten. a world where people connected for reasons beyond wealth, power, or gain. Elena's warmth and authenticity began to chip away at the walls Alexander had built around himself for years. They continued to meet at the same cafe, a cozy, unassuming spot that Alexander grew to appreciate. Unlike the opulent venues he once frequented, this place had a charm rooted in its simplicity. They would sit by the window, sipping coffee or sharing a slice of pie, and talk for hours. Elena spoke passionately about her work as a teacher in an underserved community. She shared stories of her students, some struggling with broken homes, others brimming with potential but held back by circumstance. Alexander was struck by the depth of her commitment and how deeply she cared for others. For his part, Alexander found himself opening up in ways he never had before. Of course, he had to maintain his fabricated backstory, that he was Alex, an IT technician adjusting to life in a new city. Even so, the vulnerability he expressed was real. He talked about his own feelings of disconnection, his struggles to find meaning, and his desire to do something that mattered. To his surprise, Elena listened intently, her empathy unwavering. She didn't judge him for his insecurities or probe for more details. Instead, she encouraged him to focus on the present and to embrace the journey he was on. One evening, after a particularly long conversation about her students, Alexander asked, "What keeps you going, Elena? With all the challenges you face, why don't you give up?" She smiled, her eyes softening. "Because someone has to care. If I don't, who will? Sometimes it's the little things, the smile on a student's face when they finally understand something, or a thank you note from a parent, that remind me why I do what I do. It's not about changing the whole world. It's about making a difference where you can." Her words stayed with Alexander long after their conversation ended. That night, as he lay in his modest apartment, he reflected on the stark contrast between their lives. Elena had so little in terms of material wealth, yet she possessed a richness of purpose and a joy that he envied. It made him question everything he had ever believed about success and fulfillment. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself looking forward to his time with Elena more than anything else. Their connection grew stronger, and he began to notice changes in himself. He laughed more, cared more, and started seeing the beauty in ordinary moments. The crowded subway rides that once irritated him became opportunities to observe and appreciate the diversity of human experiences. The simple meals he prepared in his tiny kitchen began to taste better because he was starting to savor life rather than rush through it. One weekend, Elena invited Alexander to volunteer at a community event organized by her school. They spent the day painting murals and setting up a small library for the students. Alexander, who had never so much as held a paintbrush, found himself covered in splatters of bright colors by the end of it. The students laughed at his clumsy efforts, and he laughed with them, feeling a rare sense of joy that was entirely new to him. That night, as he and Elena packed up the supplies, she turned to him and said, "You know, Alex, I think you're starting to get it." "Get what?" he asked, genuinely curious. "What it means to live," she replied with a smile. For the first time in years, Alexander felt truly alive. The challenge his grandfather had set for him was no longer just an obligation, it was a gift. And in Elena he had found someone who wasn't just part of the journey, but a reason to keep moving forward. As Alexander spent more time with Elena, something deeper began to take root in his heart. What had initially been a challenge dictated by his grandfather's will was now becoming a personal journey, one filled with unexpected joy, growth, and connection. His days with Elena were no longer just fulfilling an obligation. They became the highlight of his new life. Elena's presence brought a warmth that Alexander hadn't realized he was missing. She had a way of grounding him, pulling him out of his own head and helping him focus on the beauty of the present. Her laughter was infectious, her kindness boundless, and her ability to see the good in even the hardest situations left him in awe. Alexander, for all his worldly success, found himself humbled by her strength and resilience. One evening they met at a small park near her apartment. The autumn air was crisp, and the trees were ablaze with hues of orange and gold. They sat on a bench, sipping hot tea from thermoses Elena had brought, and talked about their dreams. For the first time, Alexander found himself sharing his true thoughts, albeit carefully, still keeping his billionaire identity hidden. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice quiet. "About how it's not about changing the whole world but making a difference where you can. I think I've spent so much time chasing the big picture that I forgot to see the smaller ones." Elena smiled, her gaze softening. "Sometimes the small things are the most important. They're the moments that make life worth living." Her words lingered in the air like the warmth of the tea in his hands. Alexander hesitated, then asked, "What's the most important thing to you, Elena?" Without missing a beat, she replied, "Connection. Whether it's with my students, my family, or someone I care about, it's the people in our lives who give us meaning." Alexander's chest tightened at her answer. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how hollow his own life had been before this challenge. For years he had surrounded himself with people, yet he had never truly connected with any of them. Elena was showing him something he had never experienced, a genuine bond built on trust, understanding, and mutual care. Their connection deepened with each passing day. Alexander found himself doing things he never imagined he would enjoy, volunteering at her school events, helping her carry groceries, even cooking dinner together in her tiny kitchen. The simplicity of these moments brought him a happiness that no luxury had ever provided. One night, after a particularly long day, they walked back to Elena's apartment together. The city lights cast a soft glow on the streets, and the air was filled with the faint hum of life. As they reached her door, Elena turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Alex," she said, "I think you're different from most people I've met. There's something real about you." Alexander's heart raced. He wanted to tell her everything, about who he really was, about the challenge, about the fortune he had left behind. But he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he simply said, "I think meeting you has been the best thing to happen to me in a long time." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Then Elena smiled, leaned in, and kissed him gently on the cheek. "Good night, Alex." As she disappeared into the building, Alexander stood on the sidewalk, his heart full and his mind racing. He knew he was falling in love with her, but he also knew the truth about who he was would eventually come out. For now, though, he decided to focus on the moment, on her smile, her kindness, and the way she made him feel truly alive. Walking back to his apartment that night, Alexander realized that his grandfather's challenge had given him something he hadn't expected. Not just a new perspective, but a chance at real love. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. As Alexander's feelings for Elena deepened, life seemed to take on a new vibrancy. The days spent with her were filled with laughter and warmth, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Yet, as his affection for her grew, so did his anxiety about the truth of his identity. Every time he looked into her trusting eyes, a pang of guilt gnawed at him. Could she accept him for who he really was? A billionaire hiding behind a facade? Elena, oblivious to Alexander's internal struggle, continued to inspire him. Her work as a teacher and her dedication to her students amazed him. She often spent hours preparing lesson plans or organizing community events, pouring her heart into everything she did. Alexander found himself volunteering more frequently, helping Elena set up classrooms, or even participating in school fundraisers. The experience was humbling, but it also gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a long day of volunteering, Elena suggested they have dinner with her family. "They've been wanting to meet you," she said with a smile. "I've told them so much about you." Alexander hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. He hadn't interacted with a family in years, not in any meaningful way. His parents, while proud of his success, had always been distant and business-focused. The thought of sitting at a dinner table surrounded by warmth and conversation both excited and terrified him. "Are you sure they'll like me?" he asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. Elena laughed. "They're going to love you. Just be yourself." The following Saturday, Alexander found himself standing outside a small but cozy home in a quiet neighborhood. As Elena led him inside, he was immediately enveloped by the sound of laughter and the aroma of home-cooked food. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Morales, greeted him with open arms, and her younger sister, Sophia, bombarded him with questions about his life. Dinner was unlike anything Alexander had experienced in years. The meal was simple but delicious, served on mismatched plates around a modest dining table. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from light-hearted family stories to passionate debates about education and community. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt like he belonged somewhere. After dinner, as he helped Elena's father wash the dishes, Mr. Morales struck up a conversation about an old car he was trying to repair. To Alexander's surprise, he found himself genuinely interested, asking questions and even offering suggestions. It was a far cry from the sterile business discussions he was used to, and he realized he enjoyed this kind of connection far more. As they said their goodbyes that evening, Mrs. Morales handed Alexander a small container of leftover dessert. "For later," she said with a wink. The gesture, so simple yet so thoughtful, left Alexander speechless. Walking back to Elena's apartment, Alexander turned to her. "Your family is incredible," he said sincerely. "They're a little crazy, but they mean well," she replied, laughing. "I'm glad you liked them." "I didn't just like them," he admitted. "I loved every moment of tonight. It reminded me of something I didn't even know I was missing." Elena looked at him curiously but didn't press further. As they reached her door, she gave him a warm hug. "Thank you for coming tonight, Alex. It meant a lot to me." As Alexander walked back to his own apartment, his thoughts were a whirlwind. Being with Elena and her family had shown him a life he had never known, a life full of love, laughter, and genuine human connection. Yet, the weight of his secret loomed over him. If she ever found out the truth, would she still look at him with the same warmth? Would her family still welcome him with open arms? That night, as he lay in his small bed, Alexander resolved to face the truth sooner rather than later. If he wanted a future with Elena, it couldn't be built on a lie. But for now, he decided to hold on to the moments of joy he had found and the hope that, somehow, things would work out. As Alexander's days with Elena grew into weeks, he wrestled with a growing sense of unease. Every shared laugh, every heartfelt moment was shadowed by the knowledge of his secret. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized how deeply he cared for her and how much he stood to lose if the truth came out the wrong way. The grandfather's challenge, once a curiosity, now felt like a test of his very soul. One afternoon, Alexander received a call from Mr. Bennett, his lawyer. "Alexander," Bennett began cautiously, "you're nearing the end of the agreed timeline. Have you thought about how you'll handle the transition back to your usual life?" Alexander sighed, glancing around his modest apartment. It had become home in a way none of his sprawling mansions ever had. "Honestly, Bennett, I don't know if I want to go back. I found something here, someone here, that feels more real than anything I've ever known." "I understand," Bennett replied, his voice softening. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, whether we're ready for it or not. It's better if she hears it from you." That conversation lingered in Alexander's mind for days. The idea of telling Elena terrified him. What if she felt betrayed? What if she thought everything they'd shared was a lie? But deep down, he knew Bennett was right. If their relationship was going to move forward, it had to be built on honesty. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One evening, Elena invited Alexander over to her apartment for a quiet dinner. It was a cozy affair, just the two of them sharing a simple meal at her small kitchen table. The air was filled with the scent of her homemade pasta, and soft music played in the background. As they finished their meal, Alexander took a deep breath. "Elena," he began, his voice unsteady, "there's something I need to tell you. Something important." She looked at him with concern. "What is it, Alex?" He hesitated, then decided to dive in. "My name isn't really Alex. It's Alexander Grant. I'm not an ordinary IT worker. I'm the CEO of a tech company and a billionaire." For a moment, the room was silent. Elena stared at him, her fork frozen in midair. "You're joking," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe that was the case. Alexander shook his head. "I wish I were. The truth is, this past month has been part of a challenge my late grandfather set for me in his will. He wanted me to experience life outside of my wealth, to understand what it means to live without privilege. That's how I ended up here, and that's how I met you." Elena put down her fork and leaned back in her chair, processing his words. "So, everything you've told me, everything we've shared was part of a game?" "No," Alexander said quickly, his voice pleading. "It was never a game, Elena. Everything I've felt with you, everything I've done, helping at the school, meeting your family, it's all been real. You've shown me what it means to care, to connect. I've changed because of you." She crossed her arms, her expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. "But you lied to me. How can I trust anything you've said?" Alexander felt his heart sink. "I know I've broken your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I couldn't keep lying to you. You mean too much to me." Elena stood up and began clearing the table, her movements sharp and hurried. "I need some time to think," she said finally, avoiding his gaze. "This is a lot to take in." Alexander nodded, understanding her need for space. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait. Just please know that I care about you more than anything." As he left her apartment that night, Alexander felt a mix of relief and dread. The truth was out, but what came next was uncertain. Would Elena see the sincerity in his actions, or would his deception overshadow everything they had shared? The days following Alexander's confession were some of the longest and most difficult he had ever experienced. He hadn't heard from Elena since that evening, and each passing hour felt like an eternity. His small apartment, once a place of solace, now seemed unbearably quiet. He tried to busy himself with work and errands, but his thoughts always returned to her, wondering what she was thinking, if she'd ever be willing to see him again. Elena, meanwhile, was struggling with her own whirlwind of emotions. She replayed their conversations in her mind, questioning everything Alexander had said and done. Was his kindness genuine, or had it all been an act? But no matter how hurt she felt, another thought lingered, the sincerity in his voice when he told her she had changed him. She couldn't ignore the connection they had shared, the moments of laughter and understanding that had felt so real. After a week of silence, Elena finally reached out. She texted Alexander, asking him to meet her at the cafe where they had first met. His heart leapt when he saw her message, though it was accompanied by a deep sense of apprehension. Was this the start of reconciliation, or a final goodbye? When Alexander arrived at the cafe, Elena was already there, sitting at their usual table by the window. She looked calm but guarded, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. He approached cautiously, his nerves evident in the way he hesitated before taking a seat. "Thank you for meeting me," he said softly. Elena nodded but didn't smile. "I needed some time to process everything you told me. To be honest, I'm still trying to make sense of it." "I understand," Alexander replied, "and I'll answer any questions you have, no matter how difficult." She studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if you knew who I really was, it would change how you saw me. I didn't want you to think of me as just another rich guy who doesn't understand real life. Meeting you has been the most meaningful experience of my life, and I didn't want to lose that." Elena sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I won't lie. I feel hurt and betrayed. But at the same time, I can't ignore the person I've come to know over the past few weeks. You've been kind, thoughtful, and willing to step outside your comfort zone. Those things felt real to me." "They were real," Alexander said earnestly. "I've changed because of you. You've shown me what it means to live a life of purpose and connection. I don't want to lose what we've built together." Elena looked down at her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I need time to rebuild trust, Alexander. If we're going to move forward, I need to know that you're serious about living a life that's more than just wealth and privilege." He nodded, his voice steady. "I am. This past month has taught me that there's so much more to life than I ever realized. I don't want to go back to the person I was." For the first time that evening, Elena smiled faintly. "If that's true, then maybe we can figure this out. But it's not going to be easy." "I don't expect it to be," Alexander said. "I just hope you'll let me try." They left the cafe that evening with a tentative understanding. The road ahead wouldn't be simple, but both of them were willing to take the first steps. For Alexander, it wasn't just about earning Elena's forgiveness. It was about proving to himself that he could be the person she believed he could become. Determined to show Elena how serious he was about changing his life and proving his love, Alexander threw himself into action. He knew words alone wouldn't rebuild trust. He needed to demonstrate through his actions that he was committed to a life of meaning, purpose, and authenticity. The first step was a bold decision that had been forming in his mind since the challenge began. Alexander called his lawyer, Mr. Bennett, and outlined his plan. "I want to donate the majority of my fortune to causes that matter: education, healthcare, and community development," he said firmly. "And I want to start a foundation in Elena's name to honor the values she's taught me." Bennett was stunned. "Alexander, this is unprecedented. Are you certain about this? It's irreversible." "I've never been more certain of anything," Alexander replied. "This wealth has weighed me down for years. It's time to use it for something greater." Over the next few weeks, Alexander worked tirelessly to lay the groundwork for the foundation. He poured his resources into creating initiatives that aligned with Elena's passions: scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for schools in struggling communities, and programs to support teachers like her. He named it the Morales Foundation for Education and Opportunity, ensuring Elena's legacy would touch lives far beyond what she could imagine. As he worked, Alexander also immersed himself in the kind of life he had grown to love during the challenge. He continued volunteering at Elena's school and found joy in the small, meaningful moments: helping a child with a book, painting a classroom, or sharing stories with the community. The satisfaction he felt was unlike anything his wealth had ever brought him. Finally, Alexander planned the most personal and heartfelt gesture of all. He invited Elena to a modest community center for what he described as a celebration of possibilities. She arrived curious but cautious, unsure of what to expect. The center was filled with children and families from her school and the neighborhood, all smiling and excited. "What's going on?" Elena asked as Alexander greeted her at the door. "You'll see," he said with a nervous smile, leading her inside. The event began with Alexander addressing the crowd. He spoke about his journey, his mistakes, and the lessons he had learned through Elena's example. Then, with a deep breath, he announced the creation of the Morales Foundation, explaining its mission and how it would support education and uplift communities. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she listened. You did this," she whispered. "For you," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "Because you showed me what matters in life, and because I want to spend my life making a difference, with you, if you'll let me." Moved beyond words, Elena embraced Alexander as the room erupted in applause. For the first time since his confession, she saw the sincerity in his transformation. He wasn't just a man of words, he was a man of action, willing to dedicate himself to something greater. As the applause faded and the crowd began mingling, Elena and Alexander stepped aside to talk in private. Tears shimmered in Elena's eyes, but a soft smile curved her lips. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. "This is overwhelming." "You don't have to say anything," Alexander said gently. "I just wanted you to see how much you've changed my life. You've shown me what it means to live for something real, something bigger than myself. This is just the beginning of what I hope to do. With you, if you'll have me." Elena looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of insincerity, but finding none. "You've taken a big step, Alexander," she said. "But this isn't just about grand gestures. It's about the everyday choices, the little ways you show up, not just for me, but for yourself and the people you're trying to help." He nodded, taking her hands in his. "I know. And I'm ready to keep showing up one day at a time. For the foundation, for this community, and for you." Elena smiled, her trust cautiously rebuilding. "Then let's see where this goes." From that day forward, their relationship blossomed anew, built on honesty, respect, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. Alexander threw himself fully into the work of the Morales Foundation, partnering with Elena to identify the needs of underserved communities and develop programs that would have lasting impact. Together, they visited schools, met with educators, and spoke to families, listening to their stories and understanding their challenges. For Alexander, the transformation was profound. He no longer measured his worth in financial terms, but in the lives he touched. Every child who received a scholarship, every teacher who found support, and every family who saw a brighter future became a testament to the life he had chosen. Elena, meanwhile, found herself inspired by Alexander's dedication and his willingness to embrace a life of service. Their personal lives flourished alongside their shared mission. Alexander moved out of his penthouse and into a modest but comfortable home near Elena's apartment. They spent their weekends hiking, volunteering, or simply enjoying quiet moments together, cooking meals, reading, or sitting on the porch as the sun set. For the first time, Alexander felt truly content. Years later, the Morales Foundation had grown into a thriving organization, transforming communities across the country. Its impact was felt in classrooms, homes, and neighborhoods where opportunities once scarce were now abundant. At the Foundation's anniversary gala, Alexander and Elena stood together, looking out at the crowd of educators, students, and supporters whose lives had been touched by their work. As the night wound down, Alexander turned to Elena, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you think my grandfather would be proud?" he asked softly. Elena smiled, wrapping her arms around him. "I think he'd be more than proud. He'd be amazed at what you've done, not just with your wealth, but with your heart." Alexander pressed a kiss to her forehead, his heart full. "And it's all because of you." Their journey wasn't without its challenges, but together they had found a life richer than any amount of money could ever provide. A life of love, purpose, and connection. And as they looked toward the future, they knew the best was yet to come.